My name is Frank Cole. I am 72 years old, and I need to tell you something that took me one summer to understand. The people who love you know your habits. They know where you are at 9 in the morning and what you are doing and whether you are paying attention. The danger is when they use that knowledge to decide what you will not notice. I notice everything. I always have. This is that story. My wife Sandra was standing at the kitchen sink on a Saturday morning in July talking to her sister Paula on the phone. The window above the sink looks out into the backyard, which is where I was, on my knees in the vegetable beds, pulling the bindweed that comes back every July no matter what I do to it, working my way along the row of tomatoes toward the corner nearest the house. I was not hiding. I was gardening. I had been gardening in that same corner of that same yard every July morning for 19 years, and Sandra knew this as well as she knew anything about my daily patterns, which is to say, completely. What Sandra did not account for was the window being open. She said, "Paula, he won't notice. He never looks at the statements." A pause while Paula said something. Sandra said, "I know. But Frank has never once in 31 years opened a financial statement. He leaves all of that to me. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him." Another pause. Sandra said, "Just trust me. By the time anything shows up, it'll be too late to matter." I was on my knees in the tomato bed with my hands in the dirt, and I did not move. I finished pulling the bindweed from the section I was working on, moving slowly and with the unhurried competence of a man who has learned that the best way to get a weed out cleanly is to follow the root rather than pull against it. Then I stood up. I brushed the dirt from my knees. I carried my gardening tools to the shed at the back of the property, and I put them away, and I latched the shed door. I went inside through the back door. Sandra was still on the phone. She looked at me and smiled the way she had smiled at me for 31 years, warm and easy and entirely unaware. I said, "I'm going to make coffee. You want some?" She said, "Please." I made the coffee. I brought her a cup. I went to my study and I sat down at my desk and I called my financial advisor. Not because I had never looked at the statements, because I had looked at every statement for 31 years, and I wanted to know what Sandra had found in them that she believed I had not. This is the story of what happens when a wife forgets that the man she married spent 35 years maintaining systems that could not afford to fail. My name is Frank Cole. I am 72 years old. I was born in Gloucester, Massachusetts, the son of a commercial fisherman who spent 40 years on the North Atlantic, and who believed that the sea was the most honest thing in the world because it did not pretend to be anything other than what it was, and because a man who did not pay attention to what it was telling him did not last long on it. I did not become a fisherman. I became an engineer, which my father considered a reasonable evolution because at least I was still working near the water, and because the specific discipline I chose, the maintenance and operation of navigational aid systems, required the same combination of precision and patience that commercial fishing required, applied to different machinery. I spent 35 years working for the United States Coast Guard Auxiliary, and subsequently for a private firm contracted to maintain navigational aids along the New England coast. Lighthouse systems, buoy networks, fog signal equipment, the full range of infrastructure that keeps vessels from ending up where they should not be. The work required constant travel along the coast in all weather. The particular unglamorous reliability of someone whose job is to make sure the infrastructure that everyone depends on continues to function whether anyone is watching or not. I was on call every other weekend for 22 years. I responded to failures at 2 in the morning and in January storms and in the middle of my daughter Carol's school play because the buoy marking Rockport Harbor had gone dark and vessels were already rerouting. The work required, above all, the ability to read systems carefully and to understand the difference between a system that is functioning correctly and one that appears to be functioning correctly but is not. Those two conditions look identical to the untrained eye. They look entirely different to someone who knows what to look for. I had spent 35 years learning that difference. I was not going to stop looking for it because I had retired. I retired 6 years ago at 66, when my knees made the climbing work impractical and when the firm had a younger engineer who was ready to take over the contracts I had managed. I retired without regret. The work had been good work, and I had done it well, and 6 years of retirement had confirmed that I was capable of filling the days without it. I met Sandra at a church social in Gloucester in 1991. She was 34 years old and she worked as an office manager for a medical practice in town, and she had, from the first evening, the particular quality of organized warmth that I had spent 34 years not finding in anyone else. We were married 8 months later. We moved to the house in Rockport when Sandra's mother needed to be closer to family, and we had lived there since. Sandra managed the household finances. This had been a natural division from the beginning of our marriage, because Sandra had grown up in a household where her mother had managed everything financial, and because she was good at it, and because I was occupied with work that required sustained attention and had been glad to have the household running without requiring my involvement in the details. I was not uninvolved. I was informed. Sandra provided monthly summaries and I read them. When significant decisions came up, we discussed them. The arrangement worked because we both understood it and because Sandra was honest and because I trusted her. I had trusted her for 31 years. On a Saturday morning in July, I knelt in the tomato bed and listened to my wife tell her sister that I never looked at the statements, and I thought about 31 years of trusting someone and what that trust looks like when someone decides it is an asset they can use. Sandra is 69 years old. She has her mother's organizational gift and her father's stubbornness and a quality of practical intelligence that I had admired for 31 years and that I now understood had been applied to a problem I had not known existed. She grew up in Gloucester, the elder of 2 daughters. Her sister Paula is 65 and lives in Marblehead and works in real estate and has been, in 31 years of being my sister-in-law, consistently warm and consistently in Sandra's corner on every question that arose between them and the rest of the world. Paula and Sandra speak every Saturday morning. They have spoken every Saturday morning for as long as I have known them, a habit carried from a childhood in which Saturday morning was the time their mother made pancakes and the family assembled and talked about the week. The pancakes are gone, but the call remains, every Saturday at 9, as regular as any system I have ever maintained. I had never paid particular attention to these calls. They were Sandra's calls with her sister, and they were not my business. They happened in the kitchen while I gardened or in the living room while I read, and I moved through the house around them, the way you move through a household that has established rhythms you have learned to accommodate. I knew the calls happened. I knew they happened at 9 on Saturdays. I knew they lasted between 30 and 50 minutes depending on how much had occurred in each sister's week. This was simply the texture of the life we had built, and I had moved through it without question for 31 years. On the Saturday in July, I was in the right place at the right time with the right window open to hear something I had not been meant to hear. And the thing I heard made every small deviation I had noticed in the preceding months suddenly legible in the way that a navigational chart becomes legible when you find the landmark that orients everything else on it. Sandra had been different in the months preceding that Saturday. Not dramatically different, not in ways that would have alarmed a person who was not paying attention. Quieter in certain conversations, more deliberate about the mail. Quicker to volunteer to handle phone calls that in the past she had sometimes asked me to take. I had noticed these things in the particular way of someone who has spent 35 years reading systems for subtle deviations from normal operation. I had not yet understood what they meant. The Saturday in July provided the context. I called my financial advisor on that Saturday morning from my study with the door closed and a cup of Sandra's coffee cooling on the desk beside me. His name was Tom Brewer. He had managed our retirement accounts for 14 years, and he was 62 years old and methodical in the way of a person who has spent their career understanding that the most important thing they can do for a client is not lose the client's money. I said, "Tom, I want to go through every transaction in every account for the past 18 months. He said, Of course, Frank. Is there something specific you're looking for? I said yes, but I want to see the full picture before I describe what it is. He sent me the complete records that afternoon. I spent the evening going through them at my desk with the particular focused attention that the work required, following each thread to where it actually led rather than where it appeared to lead. What I found was not what I had expected to find, which is to say it was not a large, obvious problem. It was a series of small movements, individually unremarkable, collectively significant. Sandra had established a separate savings account in her name alone 11 months earlier. I found this not in our joint records, but in a document that had arrived in the mail 2 months ago and that Sandra had collected from the mailbox before I had a chance to see it. I knew about this document because I had seen the envelope in the recycling bin and had noted the return address without understanding at the time why it registered. The account contained, as of the most recent statement Tom had on file, $41,000. The deposits into it had come from our joint checking account in amounts of between $800 and $1,200 per month, consistently, for 11 months. The amounts were small enough to fall below the threshold that would trigger an automatic notification from our bank and large enough to accumulate into something significant over time. $41,000. 11 months. $800 to $1,200 per transfer. I had read every financial statement Sandra had provided in 31 years of marriage. What I had not done was verify those summaries against the underlying account records, because I had trusted Sandra to provide accurate summaries, and she had, until 11 months ago, provided them. I called Tom back at 8 that evening. I said, I found what I was looking for. He said, "What did you find?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Frank, what do you want to do?" I said, "I need 2 things. I need to understand whether there's more that I haven't found yet. And I need to protect the retirement accounts before anything else moves." He said, "I can put a hold on any outgoing transfers from the retirement accounts pending your written authorization. That's within my authority as account manager." I said, "Do it." He said, "And the rest?" I said, "I'm going to call Margaret Chen." Margaret Chen had handled my legal work since 2008, when I had needed an attorney for the firm's contract renewal and had been referred to her by a colleague. She was 61 years old and precise, and she had a quality I valued above all others, which was that she told me what was true rather than what was comfortable. I called her Monday morning. She had an opening at 10. I was there at 9:55. I told her everything in the order I had found it: the Saturday conversation, the separate account, the 11 months of transfers, Tom's hold on the retirement accounts. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Frank, do you have any idea what Sandra is planning to do with the money?" I said, "I have a theory." She said, "Tell me." I said, "Paula is in real estate. Sandra has been closer to Paula in the past year than she had been in years before. There is a property for sale in Marblehead that Paula has mentioned twice in my presence in the past 6 months as a significant opportunity," Margaret said. "You think Sandra is accumulating a down payment?" I said, "I think Sandra is accumulating something. Whether it's a down payment on a property or a cushion for a different kind of separation, I don't know yet." Margaret said, "Have there been other signs of difficulty in the marriage?" I said, "We have been married for 31 years. 31 years contains difficulty the way any long structure contains stress. Nothing that I would have characterized as a crisis." She said, "But you were listening carefully enough to hear her on the phone." I said, "I was in the garden." The window was open. She said, "You were in the garden where you always are on Saturday mornings." I said, "Yes." She said, "And she knew you were there." I said, "She has known where I am on Saturday mornings for 19 years. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She said, "Frank, what do you want the outcome to be?" I thought about this for a long time before I answered. I said, "I want an honest conversation with my wife about what she is doing and why." Before I decide anything else, I need to understand what she thinks she is building and what she believes it is for. Margaret said, "And if the honest conversation doesn't produce honest answers?" I said, "Then we proceed to the next step." She said, "What would you like me to prepare in the meantime?" I said, "A complete picture of our joint assets, all accounts, all property, all holdings. I want to know exactly what we have before I sit down with Sandra." She said, "I'll have it by Thursday." I did not change my behavior in the week between the Saturday conversation and the Thursday when I sat down with what Margaret had prepared. I gardened on Tuesday and Wednesday mornings. I made coffee. I had dinner with Sandra each evening at the table where we had eaten dinner for 19 years in this house, and I talked about the garden and about the news and about Sandra's sister, and I listened carefully to everything Sandra said and did not say. She was the same as she had been, warm and organized and present in the particular way of someone who has been sharing a life with the same person for 31 years and who has settled into the specific rhythms that a long marriage develops. She made the coffee in the morning and reminded me about the dentist appointment and asked about the tomatoes and laughed at the same kind of joke she had always laughed at. I thought, during those evenings, about what it meant to share 31 years with someone and to discover at the end of them that there was a version of that person operating alongside the version you knew, building something in a separate account, talking to her sister about what you would and would not notice. I did not feel betrayed exactly. I felt something more like grief for an understanding that had turned out to be incomplete. 31 years of trust, and the trust had been right about almost everything and wrong about this one thing, and the one thing was significant enough to require addressing. On Thursday, I read Margaret's summary. It was thorough and precise, and it confirmed that the separate account was the only financial irregularity. Everything else in our joint holdings was exactly as Sandra's summaries had described it. $41,000. That was the full scope. I sat with this for a day. Then I called Sandra into the study. Sandra came into the study on a Friday evening and sat in the chair across from my desk where clients had sat when I had occasionally brought work home in the years before retirement. She had a cup of tea. She sat with the comfortable ease of someone who has no reason to expect the conversation that is about to happen. I placed 3 documents on the desk. The first was a printout of the separate account, with the balance and the 11 months of deposits highlighted. The second was Tom's documentation of the hold on the retirement accounts. The third was Margaret's complete asset summary. Sandra looked at the documents. She looked at the first one for a long time. Then she looked at me. She said, "Frank," I said, "I heard you on Saturday. In the garden." The window was open. She was quiet. I said, "You told Paula I never look at the statements." "Sandra, I have read every financial statement you have given me for 31 years. What I trusted you to do was provide accurate summaries. For 30 years you did. For the past 11 months you provided summaries that did not include this account." She said, "I can explain," I said. "I would like you to." She said, "The property in Marblehead. Paula found it 18 months ago. A small house, good location, undervalued. She thought it was an opportunity." "I thought it was an opportunity." She paused. "I knew you would say no." I said, "Why did you think I would say no?" She said, "Because you always say no to investment properties. You have said no 3 times in 31 years. I said, "I have said no to 3 specific properties for specific reasons that I explained each time." She said, "You would have said no to this one too." I said, "Sandra, I might have. But the answer to a no I haven't given yet is not to build a separate account without telling me. The answer is to make the case and have the conversation." She looked at the account statement. She said, "I thought if I had enough for the down payment it would be a done thing and you couldn't say no to something already done." I said, "You thought you could present me with a fait accompli?" She said, "Yes." I said, "And you told your sister I wouldn't notice." She said, "I was wrong about that. I said, yes, you were. We sat for a long time. She said, what happens now? I said, the retirement account hold stays in place until we have had a full conversation about our finances and established a structure going forward that we both understand and agree to. The separate account comes back into our joint holdings, or it is accounted for clearly as your separate property with my full knowledge. Nothing moves without both of us knowing. She said, and the Marblehead property? I said, tell me why you think it's a good investment. She looked at me. I said, make the case, Sandra. That is how this works. Not a separate account in a hope that I won't look. The case. She made the case. It took 40 minutes. She had been preparing it for 18 months, and it was thorough, and she presented it with the organizational precision that had made her excellent at managing finances for 31 years. When she finished, I said, I'll look at the numbers with Tom. She said, you're not saying no. I said, I'm saying I'll look at the numbers. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm sorry, Frank. I said, I know. She said, I should have just asked. I said, yes, you should have. Tom and I reviewed the Marblehead property numbers over 2 sessions. The property was, as Sandra had described it, genuinely undervalued and in a location that the market had been moving toward for several years. The investment thesis was sound. The return projections were conservative and achievable. I told Sandra we would do it. She looked at me the way she had looked at me at the church social in 1991, surprised and warm and not quite able to conceal either. I said, it's a good investment. You made a good case. She said, I should have made it 18 months ago. I said, yes, but you're making it now. The property was purchased 3 months after the Friday conversation, in both names, with full documentation that Margaret reviewed and that I read in its entirety before signing. Sandra managed the acquisition process, which she did with the organizational competence she had always brought to financial matters, and I was informed at every step of every decision. The hold on the retirement accounts was lifted the week after the Friday conversation, after Sandra and I had sat with Tom and gone through the complete financial picture together for the first time in 31 years. Tom said, afterward, that it was the most productive client meeting he had had in years. Paula called me 2 weeks after the Friday conversation. Sandra must have told her something because Paula was careful in a way she had not always been careful with me, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understands that a line has been crossed and that the person on the other side of it has noticed. She said, Frank, I want you to know I wasn't trying to help Sandra do anything dishonest. I thought she had talked to you. I said, I know, Paula. She said, she told me you'd agreed. I said, I know that too. She said, are you two all right? I said, we're working on it. We are working on it. 31 years of marriage contains the kind of accumulated trust that does not dissolve over one violation of it, provided the violation is addressed honestly, and the address is genuine, and both people are willing to do the work of rebuilding what was damaged. That work is not dramatic. It is not a single conversation or a single decision. It is the daily accumulation of small, honest choices made consistently over time, which is how trust is built in the first place and how it is rebuilt when it has been damaged. Sandra leaves the financial summaries on my desk now, not because I asked her to, because she started doing it in August, the month after the Friday conversation, and has not stopped. She places them on the left side of the desk where I can see them when I sit down in the morning with my coffee. The summaries include everything. All accounts, all transactions, all balances. I read them in full. She knows I read them in full and she prepares them accordingly. Neither of us has mentioned this change or its significance. It does not need mentioning. It is simply what we do now, the particular adjustment of a relationship that has found a more accurate footing after a period of operating on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. I am 72 years old. I spent 35 years maintaining systems that could not afford to fail, systems that guided vessels through water that did not forgive navigational errors. The work required attention to the difference between a system operating correctly and a system that appeared to be operating correctly while something fundamental had shifted. Sandra believed I did not look at the statements. She was wrong about this. What I had trusted her to do was translate the statements accurately into the summaries she provided, and for 30 years she had done this faithfully. For 11 months, she had not. The thing I keep returning to is not the separate account. It is the Saturday morning conversation. She knew I was in the garden. She knew the window was open. What she did not account for was that a man who has spent 35 years listening for the specific sounds that indicate something is not right will notice even when the sound is not meant for him. I notice everything. I have spent a long time in proximity to things that fail quietly, and I have learned that quiet failure is the most dangerous kind, precisely because it goes undetected until the moment it cannot be ignored. I heard my wife tell her, "Sister, I wouldn't notice." I noticed. I had been noticing for months. I was simply waiting until I understood what I was noticing before I said anything about it. That is not cleverness. It is patience. And patience, applied consistently, is the most powerful tool available to anyone who is willing to use it. The Marblehead property is doing well. Sandra sends me the quarterly reports. I read them. The tomatoes came in strong this year. Best crop in 5 years. I was in the garden every Tuesday and Thursday morning through August and September, pulling bindweed and tying up the vines and paying attention to what each plant needed and providing it without announcement. Sandra brought me coffee on Tuesdays now. She came out through the back door at 9:15 and set the cup on the garden wall and went back inside. She had not done this before July. She did it every Tuesday through the end of the season without saying why. I did not ask. The doing was the statement. We had learned that from somewhere. The best move is the one they never saw coming. Tell me in the comments, has someone underestimated your attention in a way that cost them? I want to hear from you.